In the year 70 AD, Roman legions sacked and burned Jerusalem. Israel would remain a nation in exile for nearly 2,000 years. But in the aftermath of World War II, the people of the book returned home. Israel's rebirth and survival in the 20th century has often been called a miracle. Those who were there cite their own experiences as proof. I'm Michael Greenspan. I'm an investigative journalist. These are their stories. I arrived in Israel 13 days ago with the assignment from my network to investigate stories of miracles that an incredible number of people in Israel claim have happened either to them or to someone they know, especially during Israel's wars in the 20th century. The time has gone quickly. I feel I've only begun to touch the soul of this country. Yet I have to make my final report and end this assignment. I don't know how it will end, but I do know how it will begin. In the search for miracles here, there is no better place to look than the very existence of Israel itself. Modern Israel is more than just a Jewish state reborn. It's a kaleidoscope of people and lifestyles from every walk of life. A mosaic of human energies joined together to build the only democracy in the Middle East.
על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
That it ever came into being, that once declared it survived it all, is beyond belief. It gives new meaning to the slogan, against all odds. But to understand why requires a look back. Born out of the ashes of the Holocaust, it was just one day old when it was attacked by 12 armies that the world fully expected would annihilate it. It was one tank and 5 cannon with which to fight back an armada against them. And yet, Israel won. How? Every time Israel has been attacked, Pentagon and Kremlin leaders have declared defeat as inevitable. In 1973, the odds of surviving were so impossible, Prime Minister Golda Meir considered suicide. The cabinet drew up plans for a government in exile. Complete annihilation was a certainty. At the last minute, American aid, provided by a president considered by many to be devoutly anti-Semitic, provided the largest airlift of arms since World War II to save Israel. Why? The military experts at West Point won't study Israel's wars because their outcomes are too impossible. But the anomalies don't stop on the battlefield. How did Hebrew become the only dead language in history to be revived after 2,000 years? Why would millions of people from around the world leave their homes and move to a desert wasteland to build new lives for themselves? How did these people manage to turn a land more than 80% desert into one of the largest food and flour exporters in the world? Why have incredible achievements in science, medicine, and new technologies happened here in greater concentration than anywhere else? There are no logical answers. Some say these things can only be explained as miracles. But are they? I began this assignment as a confirmed skeptic when it comes to miracles. I would have defined myself as an agnostic. But part of my reason for taking this assignment was to find out for myself if there was any truth to all of this. Over the days I've been here, I've met some remarkable people, each of whom told me of an experience they are convinced was a miracle. Some of their stories cannot be explained in any other way, Each one has given me a different perspective on miracles and on life itself. David Yaniv was leading a platoon of men across a field in the Golan Heights when he suddenly realized they'd wandered into an enormous minefield.
A very, very strong gust of wind came. Something which we could not explain at all. I mean, it was so strong that we literally felt that we were flying away. That's how strong it was. And mines that were buried 25, 30 centimeters in the ground just exposed themselves. And we didn't have to dig them out. We were just walking through them.
Like the parting of the waters of the Red Sea so Israel could escape Egypt, that strange wind marked the way for David and his men to escape that Syrian minefield. Yet I was struck by David Yaniv's confession that it was not until later that he realized that he and his men had experienced a miracle. Perhaps because I don't expect them. I don't recognize them when they happen.
A miracle is a supernatural occurrence, something which you cannot explain, but it does happen. A wind like this didn't happen before. It didn't happen afterwards. The minute these mines were exposed, that was it. There was no more wind. It was like the calm after the storm. I didn't partake.
As another man I met put it, you can usually choose to believe a miracle happened or not. Maybe we don't recognize miracles so much because on some level we realize that if we did recognize them, our lives would never be the same again. If David's story is true, it's a reminder that God must care for individuals as much as he cares for the outcomes of nations. Helping David and his men to navigate that minefield did nothing to win the war, but it saved their lives and showed how much God cares for each of us. Historian Judah Knoblauch told me about a British Army commander named Vivian Gilbert, who during World War I faced an enormous Turkish garrison at the cliffs of Michmash, the place where the Bible records Jonathan once killed 30 Philistines, resulting in an unexplainable panic that caused the entire Philistine camp of several thousand trained soldiers to suddenly flee in fear. Gilbert read this Bible story the night before his attack on the Turks, then changed his battle plan. To admire those like Vivian Gilbert who are willing to risk everything on their faith. I'm usually guided by finding a rational, logical solution to problems. But Vivian Gilbert mounted a 20th century battle plan based on a Bible story that required a miracle for its success. On the one hand, that sounds foolhardy. Yet the alternative, a frontal assault, would have undoubtedly cost many lives and a serious probability of defeat. When we find ourselves up against the wall, facing a crisis that could destroy us, it could be that faith, if truly believed, really is the logical choice. In the context of history, the World War I British campaign in Palestine was filled with stories like Gilbert's. But I was surprised as anyone to learn that the date declared in Daniel's prophecy marking the beginning of Israel's liberation was the very day of the Turks' surrender of Jerusalem to the British Army. Had the Turks not been driven out by the British in 1917, the stage would never have been set for Israel to be reborn in 1948. Historian Yehuda Knoblauch put it this way.
God makes history, makes the future too.
There was a Deir Zik, whose son Nathan commanded an outpost in Lebanon in 1980. In order to abandon their post, Zeke and more than 50 men with him had to walk more than 4 miles directly in front of enemy gunfire all the way. Despite the fact that 50 men on foot were in clear view of enemy fire for more than 4 miles, not one of Nathan's men was shot. It was as though the biblical story of God blinding the eyes of Lot's enemies as he escaped the doomed city of Sodom was repeated. Almost all of the miracles I was told about can be found in some form or another in the Bible. It's as though they're reminders that the God of the Bible seems to be as concerned about our lives and about the Israel of today as he was concerned about those in ancient times.
My son said to me, it was as if God took me a long hell for about an hour and got me out back to paradise, back to life. This is something that doesn't make sense unless you look at it as a miracle.
Ezra Yachin was a teenage freedom fighter in 1946, doing his part to wage a guerrilla war against the occupying British. Like the mother of Samuel in the Bible, Ezra's mother prayed a prayer of blessing over her son, that the 16-year-old teenager wouldn't be seen by his enemies. Ezra told me that there were hundreds of times like this one when he should have been seen and wasn't. His mother's prayer of blessing is his only explanation.
I won't talk about miracles. I say there's a promise. And there's a covenant. I feel part of it.
Many others I met shared similar stories of answered prayer. It made me wonder if the reason we don't see more miracles is because we don't ask for them, or certainly don't expect them to happen. Gershon Bar Kokhba recounted an event that, had it not been seen by so many people, would be impossible to believe, when hundreds of Arabs attacked a platoon of young Israeli soldiers defending Mount Zion in the Independence War. The Israelis ran out of bullets. They were certain they'd be killed. That's when Gershon said a miracle happened. What did the Jordanian soldiers actually see when they looked up in fear and shouted Abraham as they turned and fled? Was it a miracle appearance of Abraham in the sky, or just a mirage? Either way, the miracle is that they ran away when nothing should have prevented the Israelis from being killed or captured that morning.
Even the people that fought in that fight don't believe. It doesn't make sense. Something else happened over here.
It makes me wonder if sometimes the good fortune I've experienced may have been more than just good fortune. I wonder how many times all of us have failed to recognize miracles among us. Margalit Zinati has lived in Pekin all her life. She described one night when her village was attacked by Arab terrorists bent on killing the Jews, burning their houses, and stealing their belongings. The terrorists were apparently in for a surprise.
A column of these robed men suddenly appeared. They lifted enormous swords into the air, lighting up everything. The Arabs were so frightened, they threw down their weapons and ran off into the forest.
As a journalist, I find it hard to validate a story like Margalit's. There are no living eyewitnesses, only an old woman who remembers the story as it was told to her as a child.
It is not a legend. It is true. My grandfather told my father, and he told me. It is a miracle from heaven.
And yet, whether or not angels appeared in Pekin, the Jews of this village survived. The commitment of Margalit's family to endure hardship and difficulty, their commitment to the land of Israel, is a statement of faith that I can't help but admire. Avigdor Kahalani was commanding a company of tanks in 1967, when in a single moment his life was changed forever. Kahalani is a great hero that I was honored to meet. Yet his experience is a reminder to me that it is most often in the crucible of a crisis that we are shaped for greater achievements. Kahalani's trial by fire prepared him to face and defeat the Syrian army in 73. With a courage unmatched by any of his fellow commanders in the Golan. After Sinai, he endured a year of operations and physical pain, then changed his own medical record so he'd be allowed to fight again, all because he believed in the cause of Israel. I was still a young man in college when Kahalani single-handedly held back the Syrian advance in 73, long enough for Golda Meir to secure the American aid that enabled Israel to turn the tide and win the Yom Kippur War. But that story taught me that one man can make a difference. For Kahalani, his heroism joined his deep faith to make him the instrument of saving his country from annihilation. Kahalani doesn't believe God caused his suffering in 67 or even abandoned him.
It was a miracle for me to survive.
Instead, he saw God as his rescuer, embracing the hope that God had a purpose for him to continue living. I came away from my conversation with this hero of Israel wondering how differently our lives, my life, would be if we saw ourselves as part of a divine purpose, even if it hasn't yet been realized, or we can't see it for ourselves. Shula Cohen is one of the most fascinating people I've met on this trip. How she became an important spy for Israel and Lebanon reads like a 20th century remake of Queen Esther in the Bible, turning her back on her own safety and comfort to risk everything to save her people.
أعطيها الرسالة.
طبعا يومك سيدة كوهن.
شكرا.
أين الرسالة الملعونة؟
Under my breath, I told God, please, Israel does not need you now. I need you today. 6 children are going to be orphans. Please, God. When the prosecutor gave the order, one whip went down and the other up, and the blood would come from my legs. When the war was over, Israel remembered Shula Cohen.
I came away from meeting Shula Cohen wondering if I would have been so courageous to risk everything to help my people, knowing that if I did nothing, life would go on and no one would ever know but me. Shula would have been justified to conclude that as a mother and a wife with a family to care for, her first responsibility was to them. But she didn't. And because of her, hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives were spared. The lesson of her life will live with me for a long time. She gave up privilege, wealth, and comfort for the opportunity to experience a life of purpose. She was willing to lay down her life, if need be, for her fellow Jews in Israel. Shula told me of miracles in her life, but the greatest miracle of all was that she endured 7 years of brutal torture and abuse at the hand of her captors.
It was only faith in God that got me out of the jaws of death. And that was a miracle. A real miracle.
Adir, Ezra, Gershon, Margalit, Avigdor, David, Yehuda, Shula. Each of them, and so many others, invited me into their most private memories and shared the most life-changing moments of their lives. This is not what I expected. I came here looking for rational, easy answers to the claims of miracles here. Instead, I found credible, real people with experiences they believe were genuine miracles, experiences I can't disprove or explain away by mere logic or reason. But I have come to realize that in the end, it seems to come down to a matter of choice, to believe or not. When I met with Rabbi Israel Lau, former chief rabbi of Israel, it gave me the opportunity to ask this spiritual leader about my own journey of faith.
As a rabbi and a teacher, where do you suggest I begin looking for my Jewish self in this place?
From the very first meeting with the worker in the airport already. What do we have in common? And you will see that Moshiko, who is carrying the suitcases, came from Tbilisi. And you from the United States, Michael, you have a lot in common. The Yom Kippur, the shofar of Rosh Hashanah, the matzah in the night of Passover, the circumcision, the wedding ceremony, the Kaddish. When you go out from the airport, you come to cities like Jaffa, 20 minutes from the airport, remembering this story of Jonas, the prophet, who escaped from the Sea of Jaffa. He was David, fighting with Goliath, 15 minutes from the airport. Here was King Saul in Hara Gilboa against the Plishtim, and he was Samson, 10 minutes from the airport. Abraham in Beit El, Isaac in Beersheba, Jacob in Kiryat Arba. The Bible becomes alive in your eyes. You touch it. You have it in your arms. All your Jewish world is in your arms, Michael. Just open the eyes and the ears and a little bit your heart. You have it.
This has been as much a journey of my own soul as it has been an investigation of modern-day miracles in the land of my ancestors. As a journalist, I've learned to trust no one, to look under every rock for the hidden truth behind the story. But each of the people I met genuinely believed that what they experienced was a miracle. To summarize all I've seen and heard these past 2 weeks is not easy. So many vivid images and wonderful people I'll never forget. Their lives were changed by what they experienced. My life has been changed in hearing them. A window has been opened on my own soul that I didn't realize was there. My task now, call it my sense of mission, is to tell these people's stories as honestly as they told them to me. We leave in the morning. I'm still not sure how this report will end, or even if I'm capable of drawing any final conclusion on the matter of miracles. But I do have one more place I have to visit tonight. It's been a long time since I was in the synagogue. In fact, not since my bar mitzvah. But I was invited to a service tonight, and I've decided to go. Actually, I want to go. This particular synagogue's over 100 years old, but the form of worship here has been the same for over 1,000 years. A Jew from anywhere in the world would find this service familiar. Even as a non-religious Jew, I feel a certain spiritual connection when I step into this place. I can't really describe it, but I do feel it.
Amen. Please open the Chal.
Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher בחר banu mikol ha'amim, ונתן לנו את תורתו, ברוך אתה אדוני, נותן התורה.
אמן. מי שברך אבותינו אברהם, יצחק ויעקב, משה ואהרון ושלמה, הוא ילד קהל דרך מלבד הרוח הנעים.
So what is a miracle? I heard as many answers to that question as the number of people I asked. One of the people I met in Israel observed that most miracles seem to happen in such a way that you can choose to believe or not. The people who told me their stories were convinced that their lives were touched by a miracle at the hour of their greatest need, when they were beyond their own resources, when all the odds were against them, when there was no hope outside of a miracle. Whatever happened, it changed their lives, and they were never the same again. Faith became part of the air they breathe, the way they now see all of life. They seem so sure of who they are and their purpose for living. And that I envy them. I'm still searching. And perhaps for now that's enough. Perhaps that's enough for any of us on this journey called life. The last person I interviewed smiled when he told me, "Don't worry, Michael, you'll get there." I somehow believe, there's that word again, that if any of us search long enough and honestly enough, we will find the truth. and it will be very personal, and it will be our miracle. Are miracles real? Did they happen to these people I met? Is there a miracle waiting to happen in our lives? You decide.